Okay, so welcome everybody to our third webinar in the Governance and IPCAs, our Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas webinar series, brought to you by the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership, the CRP, and the IISAAK OLAM Foundation. Our panelists will provide stories from the front line of Tla-o-qui-aht Tribal Parks. So before we go any further, I'd like to invite Gisele Martin to open up today's discussion in a good way and provide some opening words for us. Jehovah.
O classes tuta cleasnapship, is Tla-o-qui-aht Tla-o-qui-aht, Mahte was a claw, ut Ijahne with Nuu-chah-nulth a claw. I would just like to speak a little bit about our culture a little bit. I was born here in Tofino at the hospital, but when I was growing up, it was first only in our language until I went to school, and then it was English and Latin together. But over the time that I've grown up here, I've come to realize many things, and one of them was that when Europeans first arrived here, certainly we were illiterate and could not read any of that stuff. But so were they when they'd seen our totem poles and stuff. They did not understand any of these things, the crests that our people use. And certainly, our people have had a connection to the land, the supernatural, if you will, and to each other. And today, to each other, we are expanding, because we all see each other here on this page here. But this song, this chant I will use, is one that was used by whale hunters when we were going out to the ocean to catch a whale to feed our communities. It was not only for ourselves, and that was for the community. But this is a song that was intentioned to bring us all together, so we are all aware of each other and what needs to happen, how we can work together. So the song is like this. We keep like we keep like on it, fire it hey yo, hey yo, hey yo, hey yo, yeah. We keep like we keep like on we keep like we keep like hey yo, hey yo. We keep quite hard. We keep quite hard. Honey, fire, honey, fire, Well, like I said, that was a song that was used for when these people were going whale hunting. My great grandfather. That was to make sure that all of us that are in the canoe, we need to work together. We need to be doing the right things at the right moment and then not wait. Because if you wait too long, you put us all in danger. Every one of us can be in danger. And that's why the people had those kind of songs, was for those things, for us all to work together. And in fact, that is one of the reasons why the people did have many of those Hinkitum dances and songs that many have not seen. And I've grown up with them. And I was very, very fortunate when I was very young that Eli's great grandfather, Nawas, he was the speaker for the chiefs here. And he was my late father's mentor. So when I was very young, he would come and knock on the door. And all he would say is, Chukwa-ha-ook. And my mother would finish preparing food for all of my siblings and take me with my dad. And my mom would go over there to Nawas, and Nawas would feed us. And while he was feeding us, he would speak, talking about my dad's roles and responsibilities in the community. A lot of these things are teachings about natural law that people from all around the perimeters, of Vancouver Island live within the natural law of those areas that they came from, because they understand those things. And I'd like to just say thanks for being all of you here today. And I will leave it at that and carry on later.
Yeah. Thanks, Joe. And I just want to, pause there because in the things that Joe spoke about is all about governance of tribal parks. I think that people, are they want to see things in a certain way, but the reality is with these governance principles and questions that people have, it's really about embracing those things that Joe speaks of, and those roles and responsibilities, the notion of ha'uk, of eating food, and hahopa, which is what the roles and responsibilities, the teachings that happen during ha'uk, like those are really the things. And I'm always reminded of something that one of our elders said to me years ago. He talked about how when he was a young boy, he went along with Shorty Frank, and they talked about with the Pacific Rim National Park Reserve that was created in 1970, and the little pieces of paper. And he said, one day, all of our lives are going to be governed by paper. We're going to need pieces of paper for everything. And that's how recent of the foreign, governance system has become established within Tla-o-qui-aht. And the things that Joe speaks of, that was what governed. That was and still is what governed our people. And so I'll just leave it at that to say, let's, it's easy to hear the song and to hear words of culture, and think, okay, well, this is the niceties that happen at the beginning, but then we're going to get into the governance stuff in the meat of the webinar. But the reality is that that is the meat of what we're talking about here today, the stuff that Joe's just mentioned to us, and we're going to go deeper into it. And I want to welcome Gisele Martin to speak next, and just whatever comes to your mind and heart. Gisele, introduce yourself and follow on what your dad has shared so far, maybe.
Chu na-ata hitchani Tla-o-qui-aht suhis uklasis Tla-o-qui-aht Tla-o-qui-aht hisakwistas mahdi ehoaset. Happy to see you all. When we say na-ata is listen up, but it's listen up with your whole being, not just with your brain and taking notes, but listen with your heart and your intuition. And that's how often speeches began and still begin at our potlatches when things need to be publicly witnessed. My name is Gisele. I'm also called Tla-o-qui-aht, Moving and Changing Behaviors and Emotions. I come from the House of Iihuas, a great and wide land from Tla-o-qui-aht Nation. Oh gosh, Tla-o-qui-aht Tribal Parks. People often talk about it now, and it's, you know, often talked about within the context of the last few decades, but in my life, it is much, much older than that. It is just the modern articulation or the current articulation of what our ancestors have always done. And we have an intergenerational relationship with the lands, the waters, the air, the spirit of the place. We have a responsibility towards it. That is what enshrines any rights that we may have. And there are roles and responsibilities, ecological roles and responsibilities that have been carried out by our families for millennia. For every single use that may be identified of anything within our territory, there is a responsibility as well. So people often approach these places nowadays, or in the last 10 years ago, even I used to say wilderness, or 15 years ago, but they say it's the pristine wilderness, untouched by man. Isn't it beautiful? We have to save it. But wilderness, if you Google the definition, is a wild place or a desolate wasteland where humans might visit, but they do not live there. They do not take care of it. They don't garden there. They don't farm there. They don't do anything like that. They just visit occasionally. So according to that definition, or the definitions I can find on the internet, there's no wilderness here. It does not exist, because we have overlapping systems of responsibility to place. It's sometimes called ha-hulthi in our language. There's a big sign in Tofino. It says, "Welcome to Tofino," in the ha-hulthi of the Tla-o-qui-aht Hatweth, in the territory of the chiefs. Ha-hulthi is often translated as a chief's traditional territory.
Just lost you, Gisele.
Oh, can you still hear me? Where did you lose me?
I just couldn't hear you for a few moments.
Okay.
Oh, I can hear you again.
Okay, thanks. So ha-hulthi is not just a chief's traditional territory, which is an oversimplification, but it is the living spirit of the place that we have an intergenerational relationship with, responsibility to. It's more akin to a marriage with a living being than a sense of private ownership of a thing that you can sell and blow up and enslave. And within that ha-hulthi, there are ancestral names, songs like the one my dad just presented, stories, and they're all connected to those sites. And so there's within all the families, there are ecological roles which are carried out. We have had forest guardians. Every area of the forest had forest guardians associated with them. There were names for different parts of the forest, just like you have names for different neighborhoods in town. There were river guardians. Every stream and river had a river guardian associated with it. And this carried on all over the place. There was people who took care of the estuaries, the clam gardens, the intertidal fishing areas, and even the deep offshore waters. In the winter time, which we are approaching now, is a time when our communities would come together. Things that needed to be publicly announced would be done, but also all the families and the witnesses of that event would present their songs and dances in honor of the event. The songs and dances were not just something pretty to look at, just like my dad, Joe, was mentioning, about our art. It's not just something pretty to look at. It is a glottographic, it's a semasiographic writing system. So the songs and the dances are encoded with traditional teachings about how to relate to those living beings and the places that those songs come from, about our roles and responsibilities. And often they would be accompanied by public speeches in regards to those sites and those beings and what may need to be done for the coming year or years. So your ancestral gardens, I have been weeding out the word wilderness as much as I can over the last decade. People often ask, well, what can I use instead of wilderness? It's such a nice romantic word. I don't know if any of you have ideas. That would be great. I usually refer to the forests here as our ancestral gardens, but it's interesting because everywhere I've gone so far on this continent, where I've had the privilege of meeting other Indigenous culture keepers, elders, the desert in Sierra Nevada, areas that look like wilderness that were presented to me as wilderness. And then I found out, no, they had ancient irrigation systems, and they even, the Paiute called them like Indian ditches, and they facilitated water for all life there before it was stolen away to LA for the last 100 years. So the place looks very different than it does now. So everywhere on this continent that, it has been, it's an overlapping patchwork of caretaking that's gone on for a long time. So in 1984, back in the 1900s, there's logging companies. Canada moved in here. Where should I start with all this? I don't know. I guess I'll say, when we think of early contact, often people go to the idea of Christopher Columbus, or here on this coast, Captain Cook, who came in 1778 and got lost in the fog, and he was rescued by the Nuu-chah-nulth. We can go back even to the story of the Boston nut ship that bombed our village, or enslaved people that held up entire tribes at gunpoint and stole the sea otter furs off of their backs. They're often called fur traders. Sometimes I think they should be called fur thefters. But there's a lot of things that happen in that early contact. But when we think of the time span of our history, as Nuu-chah-nulth nations, people of all along the mountains and the coast here, it's very, very, very old, and it stretches far beyond several hundred years. It goes far back. We have stories about the flood that covered the entire world. Many of the nations can still identify exactly which mountains the canoes were anchored to during that time. There's different stories about geological events, about climate change that have happened in the world before, from the last ice age and from before that time. And when we think about that incredible time span in history, 1778 is just a little blip in time. Canada just celebrated its 153rd birthday. That's just a little blip in time. And so we are still in early contact right now. And things are changing very rapidly, but it also explains, why we're in such flux, why many of you don't speak our Indigenous languages, why there's so much misunderstanding, why there's so much chaos. And there's also, with that chaos, a lot of possibility for positive change right now. There's a whole history of Canada and how Canada was set up. But part of that was promising the Crown that it would continue to do treaties prior to colonizing any Indigenous lands. As colonization moved west, they did some of that, sometimes in unfair terms, sometimes in treaties that still have not been carried out. But here on the coast, in what's now sometimes called British Columbia, many of the areas, they never bothered to do treaties because it was later. And they thought that by today we would either be wiped out from smallpox epidemics or completely assimilated after the Indian residential schools, in which some schools suffered a 60% mortality rate. But lo and behold, we're still here. I'm here. Eli's here. Joe's here. We're here. And woohoo. So it's a little bit of a problem because now what's known as British Columbia and has been claimed as Crown land, Canada in its own Supreme Court cannot prove that it owns. And so when Mears Island, Nuu-chah-nulth, a beautiful island with 2 big mountains on it, was going to be clear-cut logged in 1984, we had one of the first logging protests in this part of the world. Our nation blockaded, many people came to support us. We took the Canadian government to court. That court case lasted over 10 years. We spent over $5 million on it, protecting that watershed and the forests. And in their own courts, Canada could not prove that they own the land. Then that government, was trying to do litigation, and then the next government with Harper was trying to strike up treaties, and now this one is doing reconciliation. So we've declared all of our traditional territory a tribal park, and that is just to articulate to the rest of the world and the public the same thing that we've always done, which is caretaking of our territories. And those words were chosen in the 1980s. They might not be the best words. Maybe we need to change them, maybe not. There's a lot of baggage with the terminology of parks and pristine wilderness. But I think overall, it's been a really amazing experience to grow up within all that activity. And I'm so grateful for all the efforts of the individuals who've put their hearts and minds and their work toward that continued protection. People from here and visitors and people who just pass through or who support from afar. So we now have a Tribal Park Allies program. And Julian is on the call, called Pompey, and he's working very closely with our nation to help move forward. I laugh about move forward. I don't want to move forward. I want to stay deeper. But yeah, it's really cool. I'll pause there.
Nice. That reminds me of, I saw a PowerPoint presentation up in the Whitehorse earlier this year before when the pandemic was just warming up there. But anyways, and he talked about, Chief T.J. Tram talked about how the saying about running in circles. And then, but at the end of his presentation, he talked about, well, maybe it's time, instead of running in circles, we need to sit in one place and let the circle move around us. And I thought it was a really beautiful metaphor and reminds me of this notion of staying deeper. So thanks for that, Gisele. And I've been quoting you a few times about being in early contact as well. And I think it's so true. I mean, you look back, even our Wolastoqey, allies from New Brunswick who were just recently in Tla-o-qui-aht territory, their time making treaties with European nations, again, is only there, that's not ancient history. A lot, and we see that coming out with the conflict with Mi'kmaq over fisheries, where there's statements coming from Nova Scotia, people on the other side of the conflict saying, those treaties that's old news. It's time to move forward, and the idea of that we're still in early contact and we're still learning how to be peace and friendship allies, I think is a very valuable notion for people to understand in this era of reconciliation. So thanks for that. Terry Dorward was with us. Terry Seacher was with us at the beginning of the call, but he had to jump off. So I'm just gonna say his name to see if he's snuck back on yet. Terry, are you with us? He had a community emergency that he had to attend, but he said that he would be able to jump on towards the end of the call. So we'll chat with Terry. Terry, just a couple words about Terry. He plays a valuable role in our nation, both in terms of his connections to the House of Highway and his family's, roles and responsibilities connected to our Tla-o-qui-aht and the deep history of our people and the connection between Tla-o-qui-aht and Ahousaht. And also he's been an elected chief and council member for a few terms, and he's the lead of our tribal parks initiative. So hopefully Terry will be able to join us a little bit later on today. But in the meantime, I'll just introduce myself briefly. So my name's Eli. I'm from Tla-o-qui-aht on my late father's side of my family. So Albert Charlie Jr. Was my father, and his mother, Veronica, came from Ahousaht, and before then my relations go over to Toquat, and my late father's father, Albert Charlie Sr., from Tla-o-qui-aht, and his father, Harry Charlie, or Nawasam, as Joe had mentioned earlier, is from Tla-o-qui-aht. And that's how I'm connected to the Martin family, that my great grandfather, Nawas, had a sister, and that's where the lineage joins with the Martin family. On my mom's side of my family, we're Dutch Mennonite immigrants from Europe and down to Mexico. Our Mennonite relatives were persecuted by the Catholic Church for their beliefs, and so had to live in different places throughout Europe, and tried down in Mexico, but ended up coming to Canada to settle down. And they didn't know that they were part of this colonial initiative to so-called settle the West, right? My grandfather was a farmer, and his main thing was providing for his family, and he believed that the mass production of food, he bought into the idea that the mass production of food was needed to feed the starving people of the world, and he thought it was just his kind of Christian ethic to do that. And if you know Mennonites, Mennonites have often involved themselves in addressing injustice and poverty in different places around the world. And but my mother and her siblings didn't want to live on an industrial farm site. Industrial farming was condoned by the state. The use of fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides was standard business practices. And ironically, it's our families that pay the cost of those bad practices, as well as the environmental degradation and the damage to Indigenous lands. We're Treaty 2 country here in Brandon, Manitoba, in the heart of the Métis homeland. And but the epidemic of cancer and other you know, obviously we don't know definitively, but the use of those herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers in our lands here gets into the drinking water, and it impacts every aspect of life. My mother's mother died young of cancer, and it's rampant in that on that side of the family. And but anyways, they left the farm and they went out west to Tofino initially, and that was in the late 1970s. And so that's kind of where we, you know, that generation kind of went into the flower child, or like the hippie movement, and you know, turned their back on, you know, the system, so to speak, and like industrial farming and all the rest of it, and ended up part of the supporters in those early days in the late 70s in Tofino, and came together around those shared values. And so that's, in a nutshell, that's my story of who I am. And I went to study at Brandon University here and studied political science. And the Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council supported my education. And I'll never forget, in the application for that funding, I was challenged as a young person in my early 20s to articulate or to think about how my education is going to, how is it going to support my nation, like Tla-o-qui-aht. How is the courses that I choose, the projects that I choose in my university, how can I use that to support my nation? And so, you know, after graduating, I moved home, and I actually toured with Tla-o-qui-aht Cultural Adventures for a summer, and volunteered, and then started working for my community. And it wasn't long when I encountered the notion of tribal parks. And it's worth noting that in 2005, the idea of tribal parks had kind of grown cold. It wasn't an active conversation, because following that court case that Gisele mentioned, our nation, as well as other Nuu-chah-nulth nations, got involved in the so-called modern day treaty process in British Columbia, and which is technically it's a comprehensive land claims process, as opposed to a specific land claims process. Specific land claims happen in places where there are historical treaties, and that, as Gisele mentioned earlier, the treaty may not have been honored. And so a specific claim is about, you know, bringing about justice in those cases of historical treaty and failure to implement. Comprehensive land claims are where there is no historical treaty, such as Aquat, West Coast Vancouver Island. And so the Nuu-chah-nulth nations began negotiating as a united 14 nation front. And it was a very strong, I'm told, I was just a kid at the time, but in the heyday of the Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council, it was one of the most formidable groups because of the of just the geography along the island's mountain and the western slope of the mountains down to the seafloor is our Hahulthis collectively. And then that collective negotiating group was broken into a little bit with the Manulth Treaty that was signed in some of our central region. and southern region Nuu-chah-nulth nations signed on to the Tla-o-qui-aht Treaty. And that, so at the time, when I moved home from university and was working with my nation and supporting Tla-o-qui-aht under the leadership of Barney Williams Jr., excuse me, we were dealing with that political rigmarole of the, of the whittling down of the Nuu-chah-nulth, and there was collectively, there was dissatisfaction. There was a feeling like we were just talking in circles. Every time we ran into a mandate barrier, we had to start having a different conversation. Like there was things that provincial government negotiators had mandates for that they couldn't speak to us about certain things. And knowing what I know now and looking back, I believe wholeheartedly that those were not good faith negotiations. And now I even have associates within the provincial government of British Columbia that I will not name, but who've told me openly in meetings, it's no huge secret, that that they did not have a mandate to negotiate in good faith during those years. And it was clear, if you sit in any of those meetings, it was clear that there wasn't good faith at the table. And we ended up going around the circle of committees and talking, while meanwhile, behind the scenes, there was this aggressive action to mobilize, to liquidate resources through a variety of different means. And I'm not talking just about Clayoquot Sound here, I'm talking kind of writ large across British Columbia. And so this, disillusionment of the treaty, modern day treaty process, encouraged us to find alternative pathways to certainty. So the name of the game of comprehensive land claims, the name of the game of negotiations, industry downloaded the duty to consult from the Crown, is to gain economic certainty. And so the way that we articulated, and I came about working with the tribal parks in a bit of a roundabout way, but because, we were looking at a restorative justice program back in those days, and we developed a program, and that's how Terry Dorward with the security program started working in providing security in our communities. And the tribal parks became a vehicle to reestablish our relationship with our territory and exercise that jurisdiction, exercise that constitutional agency, and find those alternative pathways to economic certainty. So, contrary to popular belief, tribal parks wasn't just about excluding non-Indigenous peoples. During my time working directly for tribal parks in my nation, we were actively engaged in partnership development with the Pacific Rim National Park Reserve. We were actively engaged in contracts and collaboration with provincial government agencies, recreation sites, provincial parks. We were actively engaged. It's wonderful to see a strong show of the Clayoquot Biosphere Trust here, Rebecca and Laura and maybe some others I haven't seen here, but the Biosphere Reserve was another innovation that came in to create an intermediary space, with a 50-50 board governance model. Barney Williams appointed me to sit on that board of directors for a period of time. And I got to learn how useful a biosphere reserve can be to forwarding reconciliation. And so I really applaud the work of the CBT folks. And so there's this confluence of things that are happening, but to put it into context, and riffing a little bit off of Gisele's metaphor of early contact, when you look back at the history record, the earliest complaints by our Hutwith was at a meeting that happened in Opitsit in 1914. It was a royal commission on Aboriginal peoples, or the Indian peoples of British Columbia, in 1914. So the federal crown sent out representatives to meet with all of the First Nations in British Columbia to assess how Confederation was working out and if their needs were being met. Because British Columbia confederated in 1871, and beyond the Douglas treaties, consecutive provincial governments refused to negotiate treaties. And so anyways, it was said at that meeting in 1914 by Eddie Joseph and Jimmy Jim and others that our people began to be charged and to be fined and otherwise molested and sometimes imprisoned for going off the Indian Reserve boundaries, beginning in 1909. So the reserve boundaries in Clayoquot were established in the 1880s, but they were not enforced until 1909. So you have this period of time between 1909 and 1984. It's only 75 years. It's such a short period of time in that deep time that Gisele talks about, and Joe, the thousands of years, and we're talking about a 75-year period of time that Tla-o-qui-aht lost control over what happens and what doesn't happen within our territory. And the act of declaring the Mears Island Tribal Park and peacefully blockading those forestry activities, which were unconstitutional, by the way. They were not only a violation of natural law, they were not only a violation of Nuu-chah-nulth law, but those tree farm activities were and are still today a violation of constitutional law, Canadian constitutional law. They're violating their own proclamations, and they're tarnishing the honor of the crown, so-called. They continue to do that every time they exercise one of those jurisdictions. And that's something that every Canadian should be concerned about. Excuse me. So I realize I'm going on a bit of a rant here, so I'll just wrap up by saying, I think that we've made a lot of progress here in the last 36 years since the Mears Island Tribal Park Declaration. There's a lot of simple but powerful teachings. And I always think of Mary Hayes whenever I talk about this stuff. Mary Hayes, anytime she taught me anything, she would always say, the teachings of our ancestors are simple yet powerful. There's a lot of those simple but powerful teachings that are still with us today. And we collectively have the opportunity to move that forward, and in a new era of diplomacy is what I perceive across Canada, is that in the early days, in the earliest days of contact, there was diplomacy, there was some commerce, there was trading, there was good and the bad and the ugly. There was treaty making in many parts of the country. There was treaty denial. There's treaty litigation. And I believe now we're coming full circle into a new era of Indigenous diplomacy. And we need diplomats on all sides. We need people who can negotiate a renewal of those commitments that were made by the Crown in things like the pledge, the Pledge of Allegiance in 1815, the treaty at Fort Niagara in 1764, and the Silver Covenant Chain Treaty that the Thayendanegas at the Bay of Quinte spoke about earlier this year. 2020 is going to go down in history as the year of COVID, but it's also the beginning part of this year was dominated by a national coordinated movement of peaceful blockades. And the most beautiful shining light out of all of that was a humble and a beautifully written letter full of integrity from the Thayendanegas, the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte to the Crown, and reminding them of their roles and responsibilities in the Silver Covenant chain. And then when that relationship becomes tarnished, just like a piece of silver that we neglect for many years may become tarnished, that we agree to come together and shine that Silver Covenant chain and make our relationship bright and new. I'll never forget those words. They're so beautiful, coming and reminding of us of what Canada can be. So let's make, in honor of the election last night, let's make Canada great again. I'm kidding. Everyone's still awake? Too close to the Trump election for that. Has Terry Dorward joined us yet? No. Okay, so Joe and Gisele, if you have any additional thoughts that have come to mind while we've been sharing, also let's start taking questions. Let's start finding to see if there's questions from the group. Feel free to put them in there, or even just comments. Really, let's make this a dialogue as well. So go ahead. Who's next?
Eli,
Yeah.
one of the questions that's pretty common is around how decisions are made for the tribal park, getting down into sort of the decision-making processes. Can you or Gisele or Joe speak to that?
Joe here. When we look at the perimeter of Vancouver Island, for example, we look here and we know that here on Vancouver Island, there are, I would call them micro ecosystems. And I'm going to say that because I do know that the sockeye runs in Barkley Sound and Clayoquot Sound and Nootka Sound are different. And that was why way back in the day, that people had their totem poles standing up in front of their villages. Everyone would know that they have, according to their natural law, and the law of nature that prevails there is how they worked. They worked with that. And, I've seen this very different here, in regards to how resources are and have been managed or mismanaged by the Department of Fisheries, harvesting all these things. And it's had a huge negative impact on all communities. We all have to pay for it, all of us. And then, so, that is one of the biggest things that I like to notice of these different policies of the different tribes in those different areas. Like the Tla-o-qui-aht Tribal, they have their sockeye run, they harvest there when we cannot harvest ours here yet. And then I think the Nuu-chah-nulth may be even a little bit earlier than Tla-o-qui-aht. And then Clayoquot Sound is totally different for the sockeye run. And so, those things are things that I think that people just did not perhaps realize in their ways. Of course, the other teachings of natural law that occur in the many different places, people were in tune with those areas is why they were able to practice for abundability rather than sustainability. You know, and I really like to follow those teachings of you know, the ancestors that left us these things. You know, that Mother Nature will provide our needs, but not our greed. And so, you know, as long as I'm happy, I'm able to carve canoes. I like doing those things, and for me, it keeps me healthy. And you know, the other things that we really need to be addressing are other things like the Pacific Rim National Park. Let me point out a few things about that. Here, Long Beach area, Long Beach, Radar Hill beaches, Cox Bay, Chesterman Beach, Tinuis, and all the beaches all along here where people are walking here, and so many visitors come here every year. We have had 1 million visitors every year come here. And when the weather's nice, you will find many of them on the beaches. And what I have noticed here over all these years is that the sandlands populations have declined a lot. Sandlances and anchovies, they spawn at high tide in the night. When the tide's high, they go up onto the beaches and they spawn there, and then they come back out. And I know that was what is feeding those sandpipers, those little birds, and all those birds that migrate. That is what was feeding them. But now when you look at Long Beach and all the people that do walk there, and on Cox Bay and on Chesterman Beach, and of course all the development that has happened there, all the buildings, it has really disrupted the cycle there. You know, I grew up here fishing, and we'd be going with my father just by Leonard Island going out. There's always big balls of seagulls feeding on those sandlances and anchovies that were there. Now you don't see that anymore. You don't see that anymore. And I want to share something with you about fishing off of Raffle Point. Raffle Point recently has been having a more success rate of fishing salmon than here at Portland Point and close by Tofino, because there's less people walking on the beaches at Flores Island and Vargas Island. There's less people. There's very few people that walk at on Flores, so I feel that the sandlands population are thriving there because of that. And when we talk about here at Long Beach, when our people want to keep from Hisawasta to Schooner Cove closed, there's a really good reason. Of course, it's for our protection of the health of our people in this COVID pandemic that we're all facing. Plus, there's going to be a positive thing here where the sandlands and anchovy can spawn and their eggs won't be trampled. You know, I've been talking about this for years, that we have not had any movement from the parks. I have brought it up with Strawberry Island Research, and I don't know, they just didn't do anything with it, and neither has the parks. So, you know, those are things that I think that are things in the different areas that need addressing. True.
Thank you. One of the, yeah, so, and can you elaborate a little bit more, Joe or Gisele, on the decision-making processes within the tribal park system?
I have some ideas. I believe it's very personal. Our societies are structured and perceived differently. I don't know how many of you have heard the phrase, "Oh, you're at the bottom of the totem pole," meaning like you're the least important. But that's actually a really backward saying when you look at it from our cultural perspective. When we walk by in the village, the figure on the very bottom of the totem pole is closest to us, and it is integral in holding up the rest. So it goes, you know, decisions, yeah, they're overarching, they affect a lot of people, but ultimately it's what we do every single day personally, how we decide to listen to reality. Not just, again, with our minds, but with our hearts, with our guts, with our intuition. And I think that's part of our, well, it's part of our most important law, IISAAK. And IISAAK is often translated as respect, but it's a verb, and it more thoroughly means to observe, to appreciate, and to act accordingly. And that is encoded in a lot of different crests, one of which is this this like logo that's been used for our nation, but also Tla-o-qui-aht Tribal Park logo. And it's a sea serpent. It's a metaphysical being that can manifest in different ways, not always in a physical form as we see right in front of us, but sometimes in an energetic or a perception of reality. But the serpent is always moving, it's always looking back and forth. And it's really about practicing observation, not only observing, but then acting accordingly. So when we see something that is wrong, to make a decision swiftly or whatever is needed to be done and act on it. And I think that's part of, you know, the fragmentation, unfortunately, of science, is that there's a lot of emphasis on observing, but often the action, the results that need to take place are left to another party to do. And often the listening with our intuition and our hearts is often left out of the process as well. It is personal in that we are connected to the territory in a personal level. It's not us going, you know, hey, we're gonna blow up this mountain and we're gonna do this over here and we're gonna do that just for our human benefit, our short-term gain. But it's recognizing that we are interconnected with the family of life, of all of biodiversity, which shares this territory with us, and that we rely upon them for our continued existence. Eli spoke about, you mentioned Mary Hayes, late Elder Mary Hayes. She also taught me some really cool things. And one thing I remember from her is I visited her when I was 15, 16 years old, and I used to bring her plants and what do we do with this? And what about that? Because if I just told her, she wouldn't always know what they were. She didn't know the English names. But yeah, one day I got really discouraged because I realized that very few people are left who speak our languages, and that very few people know of certain things like the names of the constellations in our own language, or coming of age rituals, just different things. And I got really just bummed out about all of it. And she said to me at that point, she said, don't worry, as long as we can protect the plants and the animals and the spirit of the place, we can relearn directly from it.
Yes.
Because that's where our culture comes from. That's where we're based from. And that was back in like the early 1990s. And just shortly after that, there was the Tla-o-qui-aht protests, which were the largest peaceful disobedience at the time here, where over 800 people got arrested blockading logging roads that summer after the Clayoquot land use decision. But, you know, it really motivated me as a young person to get involved in the protection of the lands and the territories. And I think these are the same things that have guided us and have guided our other ancestors and our other family members. You know, when our nation, when individuals decided to stand at Sisikis at the blockade site on Mears Island in 1984, we had our hereditary chiefs there. My late grandfather was there, and people came to support that. So with decisions, maybe you've heard a little bit of a glimpse of how our decisions were made formally, how we had different kinds of land guardians, people who had ecological roles in caretaking the territory, and then how people would come together in the winter to make those decisions and advise our hereditary chiefs, our Hatwe, and how things would be announced and how our community would be managed through ceremony. A lot of that, unfortunately, has been heavily disrupted by the Canadian Indian Act. So we still have our hereditary, like the Hatwe, but we also have the elected band council today. And among our own nation, over the last year, we've had a series of really beautiful meetings where the two have come together along with our culture keepers, and there's a lot of healing that's taking place. But it's definitely a delicate thing, and it's very personal for every nation how to tackle that. So bottom of the totem pole is very, very important because we're the ones who do it. You know, it comes up to each of you. What are you gonna do? So yeah, we have the traditional system. We have the Indian Band Council elected system. They're striving to work together. But also the hereditary, like the Hatwe, need the support of all the guardians and the people who hold the ecological knowledge of the territories to be able to advise. Another way that we're working together as well is say through the Allies program. Just that's an offshoot of Tla-o-qui-aht Tribal Parks, but here the Tla-o-qui-aht Tribal Park Allies program was launched the other year, and we are asking any businesses, people living within our territory who benefit from our continued protection efforts to contribute, to become, to participate as allies. And so there's a series of asks in that. And I believe this list has been modified a few times and the conversation is still growing, but we got the Tribal Parks Allies Certification Standard. And here is the Tribal Parks Business Operators Protocol Agreement, which businesses are being invited to come and sign and join in. So there's a series of asks in this, including acknowledging the unceded rights and title of Tla-o-qui-aht First Nation. For me, as one of the jobs that I also do is I'm the Tla-o-qui-aht Land Vision Coordinator. So you know that it's just so connected to the whole history of what our nations have done. I can't explain that right now. Target a 1% gross ecosystem services contribution to the Tla-o-qui-aht Tribal Parks Department. Advocate for and accurately portray First Nation stewardship in all media. So, you know, if we go on somebody's website and they got wilderness all over it, maybe we can find ways to like replace that word wilderness and rephrase it. Include the Tribal Park Allies logo, maintain business practices which comply with the Tla-o-qui-aht Tribal Park land vision and plans, report territorial concerns, educate staff. So the really cool thing I love about this that I get to go to is sometimes there's these Tribal Park Allies Task Force Zoom meetings, and it's great. I'm just really, really touched by some people, and they're not Tla-o-qui-aht, but they're there and working together, bringing minds together to how can we work together? How can we make this a better living system for the future generations, not only of the human people, but all the species.
Awesome.
Yeah, land use plan. I think it's really important for us to keep going back to our traditional teachings over and over and over again. And our teachings are in our language. So we really need to keep our languages alive. There's an incredible diversity of languages in this part of the world. I've got a little map here that just shows like some of British Columbia, some of the major cultural groups. You can see the different colors. These two oranges are not the same. They just ran out of colors. But those are just the major cultural groups. In Vancouver Island here is Nuu-chah-nulth in orange. But even among Nuu-chah-nulth, there are 14 or 16 different nations, depending if you're counting us politically or culturally, including the Makah of Neah Bay, Washington. And we're all different, and our languages are different. Our languages reflect the ecosystems that of the places we're connected to. They reflect the microclimates. And when we go on events like tribal journeys, which didn't happen this year with COVID, but where all these canoes gather, there's hundreds of people and youth, and some of them are paddling for weeks to get to this destination. And then they go through the protocols as they go through different nations' territories of being hosted and asking for permission to come ashore and singing their family paddle songs to announce who they are and that they're coming in peace. I've only gotten to go on this a couple times, but when I'm in the canoe, when you like catch up to everyone and all the canoes from all the different tribes raft up, and you're waiting and you just look down the line and there's this canoe from that nation and that canoe from the other nation and that one from over there and this one, and it just is so cool and mind-blowing. But I just remember distinctly looking down the line and seeing the features of our different nations' neighbors, and they're distinct. And some years ago, I worked for a short stint in the Pacific Rim National Park Reserve as a beach keeper through a program that they had worked with Tla-o-qui-aht First Nation. And I was working with a Nuu-chah-nulth person and a biologist. Nuu-chah-nulth are from south of there, and I'm from north of there, from Tla-o-qui-aht territory, and we would cruise around the islands and check on the islands and talk to tourists, pick up garbage and look at the security and all this kind of stuff. The first day of work, I got out there, jumped out of the little Zodiac with the anchor. It was a really low tide. The rocks are covered in seaweed and life. And I jumped out with my gumboots with the anchor, and I looked down and I was like, whoa, it's this seaweed. This is like a whole different tribe of seaweed. And I was looking and I was like, wow, look at the seaweed. And then Wishki from Nuu-chah-nulth jumped out, and he got out and he's like, oh yeah, you're right. And we were looking at it just like, whoa, cool. And yeah, I was not in my territory. I was in Tla-o-qui-aht territory. It's like a different country to me, even though it's like only so far. Then Wendy, the biologist, got out and she looked and she said, oh, that's blah, 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 blah. And she spewed out its Latin name, which I've forgotten. But she did not see the difference at all. She's like, well, that's the same seaweed. This is the blah, 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 blah. And we were like, no, it's a different tribe of seaweed. I went home that night, I was lying in bed and I was like, wow, that was cool. That's a different tribe of seaweed. I'm from here, and the seaweed here is from here, and the seaweed over there is from there. It's Tla-o-qui-aht seaweed. And I was like, oh, Wishki is from Nuu-chah-nulth, that's from south. And it's even more different for him. It's a totally other seaweed. And I was like, it just really struck me all of a sudden how particular, how diverse these places are. And, people talk about, they acknowledge it all the time when they talk about regional wines in Europe, or a cheese. It's not the same cheese because it's not from the same place. But like, these seaweeds are just as different. The banana slugs are just as different. I see the difference when I get to the area where the Tla-o-qui-aht territory begins to overlap with Tla-o-qui-aht. The banana slugs are different. So we need that knowledge in all of our decision making. We can't have somebody remotely in Ottawa who has no knowledge of this area making incredible blanket decisions about salmon and rivers and the things that keep us alive. There's no word for environment or biodiversity in our language that accurately translates. The closest word we have is teachmas, and that literally is the stuff that keeps us alive.
Good, lovely, thank you. I felt like I was there in the water with the kelp with you.
It was a rockweed.
Terry has joined us. So welcome, Terry. We've just had Joe and Gisele and myself just sharing a bit, and just recently coming off now a conversation about decision making and how decisions are made. And of course, there's this, hereditary system and the elected system that work together, and while Gisele was speaking, I was reminded of the stories leading up to the Mears Island Tribal Park Declaration, and how the decision making happened leading up to that. I think people probably want to hear that. But before I go into that, I would pass the mic over to you, Terry, to introduce yourself and share some of your thoughts about tribal parks, governance, and decision making. You might be on mute, Terry, or maybe we lost you again. Oh, there's Terry. Oh, he's not even muted. Okay, while we're waiting for Terry to come back online, maybe I will share that story. And I know if some of you have heard this already, please.
Eli, sorry to interrupt. Here comes Terry now. He's on.
All right,
screen.
excellent.
Sorry, good.
Hey, there he is.
Yeah, I'll just unplug you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, everybody. I apologize. Lots going on in Tla-o-qui-aht. Yeah, I guess to start off, Tla-o-qui-aht. I come from the house of Highway, our Tla-o-qui-aht race teacher. Yeah, I was 12 years old in 1984, and I recall the immense feeling of pride marching with our Hatwi, our traditional chiefs downtown Victoria, to the Parliament buildings to create awareness, the establishment of Nuu-chah-nulth. And I think many in my generation, this had a profound impact of my political views at a very early age to stand up for Indigenous title and rights. My late uncle, Iwanuth, Tla-o-qui-aht race teacher, I remember his words that when he saw the several logging trucks of old growth leaving the territory, he felt saddened by the fact that he was losing part of his Haiholthi. Many of our songs and dances come from Tla-o-qui-aht peoples who have meditated and prayed in the forest. So we are definitely interconnected. Our worldview as Tla-o-qui-aht, what Gisele was talking about, our teachmas. I want to replace environment every time I want to say environment. I want to say teachmas. Now that I've heard it, we still obtain our strength and our power from our traditions today, and it's important for our collective leadership to reflect this in the principles of our Tla-o-qui-aht Tribal Parks declarations. There's a provision within the first declaration, Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Parks, that identifies recreational opportunities, because our Hatwi and elders seen that it was that this is an important aspect of sharing nature's experiences. I believe that they had foreseen the future and the social economic value in protecting an ancient rainforest within this region. It naturally created space and the formation of what is now called Tribal Park Allies, all those years ago. I like to view the Tribal Parks Allies program in whether it's called a contribution or fee to our tribal parks, on how we as Tla-o-qui-aht society had traditionally operated, our mustrum or people would give a portion of their food, that they gathered and give it to the chiefs. And then in turn, the chiefs would distribute it, the wealth that is generated amongst all of society, so that, that society's needs would be met. And, this is our tribal parks program that is deeply rooted in our traditional values of our ancient responsibility to ensure the well-being of our people and our teachmas. So we're putting forward those values and those attitudes today. Of course, like any colonized people, we suffer from colonization. That has created extreme divisions within our community. And, you see it in our leadership. You see it in our communities. You see it how we interact with each other. We understand that our tribal parks program is trying to reconnect our peoples back to the land so that we could heal, from the genocidal government imposed mandates of the past, like the massive depopulation from disease outbreaks, residential schools, and continued oppression under the Indian Act. We've had little success in formalizing a healthy relationship with the provincial and federal governments. Our tribal park strategy has been to go after the local businesses, the business community, where many are excited to be a part of the Allies program. They would rather contribute to the local First Nation than to the province or to Ottawa. And some businesses have even called it as their own version of reconciliation, to what the governments have done to our people. Tofino tourism revenues, I'm not sure if you talked about that, in 2018 was 270 million. A 1% tribal parks fee, if all business made a contribution, would be over $2 million. We know that this will be a process to get all businesses on board and develop. And we've developed a graduated capital plan that identifies what would be spent at certain amounts, at certain intervals. So, like at $200,000, for example, it would be the Tribal Parks Guardian Program, frontline workers. As more and more dollars come in to our tribal parks, we would be looking at community services, education and training, justice programs, community capital projects, and even regional capital projects when we get closer to the 2 million annually coming in from the Tribal Parks Allies program. Our Tribal Parks initiative competes with local businesses such as fish farms and logging to create employment. It's our objective to phase out these industrial entities and replace it with more sustainable jobs in a conservation economy that thrives and has growth. And not the status quo boom and bust economies of the past that only devastate the natural resources and moves on, leaving Indigenous people to clean up the mess. And that's basically what we've experienced. So our maybe I'll leave it at that. And if anybody would like to want me to expand on other areas.
Awesome, thanks, Terry. There was a question earlier about the tribal parks and the connection to water, and straightforward, yes, tribal parks does include waterways. Maybe, I recall, the teachings about the responsibilities that follow our whales and our fish. I don't know, Gisele, if you'd like to share something on that, or Terry.
Joe Martin here.
All right, Joe.
Yeah, thanks to all who have spoken. There certainly is a lot that we have not had much input on as Indigenous peoples and our culture, particularly. Because, you know, in the first place, it was banned. The potlatch system and our language and so on was all banned by the Indian Act and the church. But I was very fortunate, as I did mention earlier, that I grew up at Hopitsit with my parents and with Eli's great-grandfather, Nuu-chah-nulth, and learning about canoe carving and things like that with my father. When I was very young, didn't believe me, I chose to go or not, hunting, fishing, trapping, or canoe building. And it wasn't, do you want to come along? It was not like it, it's get ready, we're going. And so, you know, I feel that back in the former days, that's how it was for everyone. Every male and female, they all had a part to do and a responsibility to pass on these teachings. And that's why, you know, people still use these songs and dances that we still have today. And I've heard people sing them. But of course, you know, I have an understanding of them, and I was only fortunately because of Eli's great-grandfather and my grandparents as well. Now I'm going to talk about my father carving canoes. There's something that really bothers me about forest companies. And, you know, I sit here at my home right now and I walk out here and while I'm listening to and talking with all of you, I see these birds flying around here. And then, you know, our people had a great respect for those creatures. We had a huge respect for, you know, all the creatures. It was not just to go into the forest and cut that tree down because we're going to make a canoe out of this thing. Absolutely not. There was a protocol that pertained to those things. You had to go there and be there with that for some time, and several times to go and visit it. But the other thing that is a very important thing was that trees were cut only in the fall and the winter months, because those little birds are not, or any of the birds are not nesting at that time. None of them. And so, you know, the other things you had to be very aware of was all the creatures inside of that perimeter of where that tree may fall down. And, you know, there's wolf dens or bear dens or cougar dens. And, you know, so those were a lot of those songs and dances that people did were about awareness. And that's why they look around like that. And, you know, I learned those things from my father, my grandfather, and Nuu-chah-nulth. And you know, of course, I did learn about the sand lances and those things. And that's something I want for everyone to write a note about that today, because those are very important parts of the ecosystems. The sand lance and anchovies that are being trampled on the beaches here as people walk. You know, I think that people are getting really upset about my post about that about two or 3 weeks ago. When people, you know, were getting their back hairs were standing up. But, you know, it's the truth. And when we don't realize these things, how we're affecting those, we have to leave some places, like north of Long Beach, the Hisawasta and Schooner Cove. It's good that no one is visiting there. You know, and I know that people that live down there have noticed that other creatures this year have come along. And then there's something else I want to share about this year's pandemic. From February until maybe June, July, when boats started moving again. This is the first time in over 40 years that herrings have spawned on the east side and the Tofino Harbor area in front of Hopitsit, the first time in all that time, because there's not so much boat traffic. This year, there was only tugboats going back and forth and a few water taxis, compared to the hundreds of whale touring boats that are going by every day for that time period, watching whales and going out and seeing this and that. And then, so, you know, that is kind of a negative aspect of this tourism industry, is that exactly. And so when we did see those herring spawns, wow, that felt so good. It was like old times. There were 10 whales feeding on the east side of Vargas Island, and some of them in front of Hopitsit. I've never seen that for over all this time. So, you know, nature rebounds really quickly, and we have to let it.
Yeah, if I could just add, we did receive some funding with our relationship with the Fish Wicks program, which is Western Indigenous Knowledge Systems, where we are able to mobilize knowledgeable people about relationships with nature, people that are out on the water, people who, and also bringing in elders and our tech people, known as the traditional use committee. And I know, Gisele, you'll probably slap my hand when I say that. We'll have to come up with a different name. However, I do believe it's the start of looking at what Joe talks about, study in nature, bringing these ideas forward to the appropriate people so that policies can be made. So it's a start, but it's programs like that where we're taking our knowledge and putting it into a modern context. The Nuu-chah-nulth declaration, it identifies protection of seabeds that is interconnected with the terrestrial force. So, as a tribal parks, we look at the declaration and take it very seriously in terms of implementing programs that reflect that. Chu.
Thanks, Terry. And I saw, Rebecca, you had your hand up earlier? Or you were just waving? Okay, I wasn't sure. Yeah, thanks, Terry, for that. There was a question here about Ontario context from Lynn. Could you share any thoughts about how nations with historic treaties could advance IPCAs in their territory, especially with strong resistance from government, as is the case here in Ontario, recognizing that some are working on initiatives funded by the federal government, but establishment would need to be supported by the province? The first part of the question with regards to the peace and friendship treaties, I mean, there are recent examples like Tla-o-qui-aht. Tla-o-qui-aht is up in the Northwest Territories. It's a hybrid model. There's a national park component, there's a territorial park component, and then there's an Indigenous protected area component. And the way that has been described to me by people who've been involved in developing it from the very beginning is that they internally viewed this as a continuance of the Peace and Friendship Treaty of 1900. So often referred to as Treaty Number 8. The Dene people of that part of the world, I've heard it called Denende, but people called the Northwest Territories. They call that the Peace and Friendship Treaty of 1900. And in that Peace and Friendship Treaty, they agreed to share in the responsibilities and the benefits related to the land. And so in this case, the Tla-o-qui-aht Indigenous Protected Area is a exercise of that Peace and Friendship Treaty. So, the Douglas Treaty nations could do that as well. And this is an interesting nuance in terms of governance and law, is that in places like the Chilcotin, where they did not have historical peace and friendship treaties, in fact, their leadership were basically murdered. They were executed by the Crown government. They spent 20 years proving in court that they were there when Europeans arrived. They spent 25 years in court. Some elders died before the final decision was made in court, proving that they are who they say they are, that they are the Tsilhqot'in peoples of that part of the world since time immemorial. And the court said, well, prove it. And it's a very dehumanizing process to go through. But in places like where you have the Douglas treaties, for example, you don't have to prove that. You don't have to spend 25 years in court proving that you were there since time immemorial, because you have a peace and friendship treaty that proves you were there. Now, obviously, those peace and friendship treaties were abused and neglected, but they are there. They are still legally binding constitutional agreements. And so in that case, to Lynn and your question, you could have a tribal park or an IPCA as an exercise of that peace and friendship treaty. And then, to the other part of your question, in terms of the funding and the federal government support, recognizing that we've got some federal government people on the call today, I'll say this, and I said this recently at a different conference webinar. When in my 7 years of moving tribal parks forward in Tla-o-qui-aht, one of our closest allies was the Pacific Rim National Park Reserve and the Malasapina College, by the way. It's awesome to have Grant Murray and Leslie King on the call today. But during that time, we got funding to develop a land relationship plan, although we called it a land use plan, which were corrected by Gisele and Simca. We're talking about land relationship planning today. But at the time, land use planning and watershed planning that we did partly with funding from the federal government through the Pacific Rim National Park Reserve and something called the IISAAK Ecological Integrity Mitigation Fund. And so John Baird, who was the Minister of Environment for the Stephen Harper government, he actually flew out to Nanaimo for a photo shoot. I think it was in March of 2007, I believe, or 2008 perhaps. And he did a photo shoot with the map of our tribal parks on a large blown up picture behind where he was shaking hands with one of our one of our hereditary leaders, and to celebrate the federal government's investment in our planning process. And that was under Stephen Harper's government. I mean, my point here is that in regards to the federal funding, and in my own involvement with the Pathway to Canada Target 1, I went on video record saying that, yes, we can work with the feds and the provinces and the territories to assist them in achieving their goals under the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. But we also have to be mindful of our own goals and objectives and how we're going to harness this opportunity to forward our initiatives towards self-determination, sustainable livelihoods, benefiting from the land, and environmental security, or teachmas, keeping the teachmas healthy. And so that those kinds of partnerships can be made, and John Baird got a handshake and a photo op out of it. We got a funding for a land use plan that brought us closer together with our regional partners and really forwarded the notion of reconciliation before the term was fashionable. And so those are a couple of my reflections on Lynn's question. What else do we have in the chat? Is there another question that's come up?
I think we could open it up more broadly.
Okay, opening up for any other, and feel free to also just take yourself off mute and ask a question or make a comment.
Hello, Jeremy.
I have a thought.
Yeah.
Just we've been talking about treaty quite a bit, and I just want to bring it back and broaden the time scale, I guess, because we think of the treaties and the comprehensive treaties and the old treaties between, you know, United States and Canada and different Indigenous nations. But I want to bring it back deeper because treaties have existed long, long, long before that. And they're not even just among different nations and tribes, but they are interspecies. We have ancient agreements with bears about how to share spaces, how to respect one another. Bears have their own protocols with us. And as long as we are respectful of them, they respect us, you know, and they don't become garbage bears or anything like that. And yeah, I just want to bring that up because even within our own conversations within Tla-o-qui-aht community, you know, there's been a lot of talk about reconciliation, and we've identified that we don't need to reconcile with Canada. We haven't done anything wrong as Indigenous people. It's for Canada and Canadian citizens and people benefiting from the system to find ways to reconcile. And we need to find ways to meet with them there. But really what needs to happen within ourselves to reconcile with each other and reconcile with the land, reconcile with the family of life that we depend upon. And, you know, in these Zoom calls and on the internet, it's really, really easy and speaking English to be very human centric about everything. But really recognizing, and that's where we need to go.
Gio.
Hello. I was just wondering if you guys could provide any examples of how any like precautionary or mitigation strategies are implemented by the tribal parks for vulnerable areas in the protected area, like if there's any examples that you guys could provide.
Precautionary. Yeah. The first thought that comes to my mind for that is the definition of kuas in Nuu-chah-nulth. The first person who talked to me about this was Ron Martin. And he talked about how kuas mean, you know, as Indigenous peoples, you know, even in my own short lifetime, we've gone from Native, Indian, Aboriginal, First Nations, Indigenous. Those are, you know, 5, you know, politically correct terminologies to refer to like a pan-Canadian referral to the First Peoples. Well, that's another one, First Peoples. Anyways, and what my elders have been telling me is that those are not what we call ourselves. They say we are Tla-o-qui-aht, you know, Tla-o-qui-aht full stop. You know, we're not Tla-o-qui-aht First Nations or that stuff. Yeah. We're Tla-o-qui-aht, and oh, someone's off mute there. I think it's Pompey. But in this definition, kuas, which means real live human being, real as opposed to imagined, alive as opposed to unborn or deceased, and a human being as opposed to any other being in this world. There's also the next teaching that Levi Martin had shared with me, that we are a link as kuas, built into the very definition of human being. There's this understanding of linkage between past and future ancestors. And in a way that's like a circle, and how when we welcome a new baby into the world, we recognize that they also come from the past. So they're very ancient, they're very old in a way. It's a remanifestation of our ancestors. And as links between our past and future ancestors, there's an inherent responsibility to manage our collective inheritance with care. And so, Jiho, your question about precautionary or looking at mitigation, to me, starts in this world of ideas, in that the very way that we conceive of humanity is geared towards intergenerational accountability. That in modern North American society, we are citizens, we are individuals, we are often considered consumers, like hyper individualization. But in Nuu-chah-nulth worldview, there's this interconnected understanding of humanity that comes with inherent responsibility towards those who will inherit the world that we are living in. Joe always reminds me and the people that we bring home is that how are we going to improve this world? Not just sustain our own selves while we're alive, but improve it and make it more abundant. And I think the word mitigation has the same cultural baggage as the word sustainability. Joe spoke earlier about abundability, and I've heard Gisele speak about that as well. Sustainability, the general accepted definition, is to meet the needs of today's generation without compromising future generations' ability to meet their needs. And from our perspective, of humanity, that doesn't go far enough. We have to try to improve the world. And so mitigation comes with that same baggage in my analysis, because it says, well, if we're doing damage here, we can offset that damage by investing some resources in improving something over here. And this comes full circle back to the sun moon crest. And this sun moon crest that we have here from that the IISAAK OLAM Foundation has taken on as our logo, comes from the cabin at Tsisakis in Heelboom Bay. There, inside that cabin, there's a cupboard door that has the carving of this moon, and that's IISAAK. That's about to be observant, observe, appreciate, and act accordingly. That's your decision-making model right there. People want to talk about governance and decision-making, right? That's it. That's as simple as it gets, but it's powerful. Just like Mary Hayes always said, it's simple yet powerful. So you observe nature, and you observe how nature interrelates. I love that Gisele was talking about treaties amongst interspecies protocols. The same thing was spoken of by Dr. John Burroughs at the Canadian Environmental Grantmakers Conference in Banff, Alberta in 2018. John Burroughs provided the keynote address, and he spoke about how the Anishinaabe people observed how different creatures in the environment interact with each other, and to role model how to create balanced relationships and interspecies protocol that was emulated by the Anishinaabe people and how they enter into treaties with other groups of people. And so it's right there under the surface. And excuse me. And the last thing I'll say about that, and just referencing what Gisele had shared earlier about the totem pole, I've referred to those totem poles. Well, Joe's talked to me about how they're our constitution. They're the, and I like the words that Gisele used to describe a type of writing, symbolic. I've referred to them as symbolic memory devices, that these crests, like the moon crest here, over however many generations, stories would be told about this crest. And so that story provides a roadmap for decision making and governance. You know, I don't know how else to explain it, Monica, or anyone else out there. Like, is that, I'm wondering, I want to ask the group, is that coming through? Like, that it's not a manual that you can get off of a PDF or like with a binder in paper. These things that you learn through stories become part of your operating system in the way that you perceive the world, and then how you act. Go ahead.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've totally frozen.
Oh, you're not frozen to us. You're,
okay.
I want to, yeah, thanks, Eli. I think that sometimes we need that like literal translation of something that may be very clear in your minds, but is still in this fuzzy space, and those questions keep coming in. So it's good to kind of state, maybe it's stating the obvious over and over, but it's good to repeat that as maybe simple, but it's beautiful. And so it's worth repeating. So,
you know, the last thing I'll say on that, Monica, is Uyath Nish, Uyath Asma. And that was something that was really ingrained into my brain by Eli Martin during our Haukeman Tribal Park planning process, and other elders. Uyath Nish is the basic thing that we have to look after ourselves. And I've heard another version of this in Denende, up north in the Dene culture, is that if you come to Denende, you have to be able to provide for yourself and protect yourself, because you can't come there and become a burden on others. And I've heard the same thing in the Chilcotin, when you go out on a pack trip on horses. Jeremy's been on many of these. If you're not doing the basic stuff of like helping to fold up the tents or helping to do things around the camp, then you become a burden on, and it's the same thing on canoe journeys. So Uyath Nish is about taking care of ourselves, and Uyath Asma is about taking care of our precious ones. And so to just give that very specific decision-making example, and Josie and others from Tofino may recall when we had the dry spell, I don't know if it was 2008 or 2009, there was a big, and we had John Fraser was, late John Fraser was our mayor at the time, and they turned off the taps on like Labor Day long weekend or something like that. And Life Peterson and John, that 2006, oh my God. Life Peterson, who was the CAO at the time, and John Fraser came to meet with us and ask for our permission to expand the water reservoir at Gennard Creek. And when I went back to the chiefs and spoke to them about that, this idea of Uyath Nish, Uyath Asma came up. And Uyath Asma means we have an inherent responsibility to take care of our precious ones. And from the Hotwith perspective, because Tofino is within our territory, they depend on us for their well-being. And yes, if they need water, Uyath Asma, it's part of our governance responsibility. And therefore they gave me direction to green light that water reservoir expansion. And And that, you know, it's simple. It's really just common sense at the end of the day. I know people are looking for some kind of magic elixir or whatever, but it's just good old fashioned common sense often. And how you then integrate that into your thinking. And so I see we're in wrap up mode here. So the upcoming webinar virtual campfire series, the next one, November 19th from 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern, we'll look at Tla-o-qui-aht, which has been spoken of a little bit here today. And then December 3rd from 1 to 3, looking at an IPCA virtual open house question and answer period. With that, I would like to hand the microphone over to Joe, if he's still awake. Joe, Martin, if you could close us up in a good way, that would be much appreciated.
Thank you. I'd like to share a song or a prayer that I learned. It was from late Chief Dan George from Squamish or North Vancouver area. O great spirit, whose voice that I hear in the wind, whose breath gives life to all the world, hear me. I'm small and weak. I pray for strength, not to be greater than my brothers or sisters, but fight my greatest enemy, myself. Make my hands respect the things you have made. Make my ears sharp, so that I may learn the lessons you have taught to my chiefs and elders. So that when life fades as a fading sunset, I can come to you with straight eyes. The Great Spirit, I give you thanks for the many blessings I have received, including all of you here today participating. True.
Thank you, Joe, and click-o to everyone for joining today. And Gisele and Terry, if you have any closing thoughts, I think Joe has given us a beautiful quote to carry on our day with.
Yeah,
Thank
we
you.
can do that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Bush, chuck, shit, let's chew.
You.
True.